And so one of the hard things to quantify, and you're asking like, what does success look like in a coaching? I mean, sometimes there are hard metrics that you're looking for, like, hey, I need you to help me, achieve whatever, or maybe it's a
Hmm.
promotion, maybe it's it's insight into the business problem I'm facing, and I need to hit my goals and all that stuff. But I would say the overwhelming thing that I find myself solving for with coaching clients is clarity. And it's clarity of like, what the hell am I doing? Where the hell am I going? Is it clear what I need to focus on?
Hi, welcome to the Little Things podcast with Rob Hao. Today, I'm sitting down with Brian Hsu, an executive coach, startup advisor, and former tech leader who helps scale companies like eBay, Lyft, and KiwiCo. He's now focused on mentoring founders and executives, helping them grow as leaders while building successful businesses. We're diving into his journey from corporate leadership to coaching, the biggest challenges founders face, and what it really takes to scale not just a company, but yourself. Let's get into it. Hi, Brian. Thank you so much for joining me on my podcast here. This is really only my second episode, and I'm really happy that you're able to find time and join me here on the Little Things with Rob Hao.
I'm happy to help you work the kinks out.
Awesome. So, I would love for you to kind of give an introduction for yourself, but I also have this question, and I think answering this question would actually kind of do a lot of the self-introduction by itself, which is, having spent most of your career in Silicon Valley, it would be easy to assume it's home for you, but actually you grew up on the East Coast in a New Jersey suburb. So could you share a bit with the audience of your journey? Clearly you prefer West Coast living now. And what's the biggest way your East Coast upbringing still shows up in your life today?
Yeah, sure. That's a very interesting question. And so, yeah, I've been slowly migrating west, I guess you could say. So I spent the first 18 years of my life in New Jersey, just outside of New York. To me, growing up, the city was New York City. And so that actually has a lot to do with my outlook on life. I soon discovered that when other people talked about the city, when they were near Cleveland or they were near Dallas or they were near, Seattle, I thought all cities were the same. I thought they were exactly like New York. And I was, nothing against any other city, but in the US, at least, there aren't too many cities like New York. And I was sorely disappointed to find that a lot of these cities are just smaller and don't have as much what I would call, cultural vibrance or what have you. That was just a standard that was in my head. But yeah, so I grew up in New Jersey, and then I ended up going to my undergrad in the Midwest, and then came back for a while, worked in New York, but then went out to the West Coast. I have a lot of family out here in the West Coast, and it was an easy throw for me because there was a support network here. Went out for grad school, and then have worked, as you said, in Silicon Valley ever since. I think the thing that there is definitely an East Coast to me that's definitely part of my whole journey, which is, East Coasters tend to be very direct,
Yeah.
and they just tend to like tell it like it is, and they'll when they get upset and they start yelling and screaming, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's sort of like this veer off into crazy land. It's a way of communicating. So I'm not like that. And so a lot of people think that I come from the West Coast because I tend to be a little bit more mellow and calmer, but you'll see my East Coast side come out when I'm angry or when I'm emotional about things. And it's not meant to be, throwing down my toys and, starfishing on the ground. It's a cultural thing, really. And so, that's a big part of my upbringing. And so I feel very at home when I go back to the East Coast, and I hear the accent of the East Coast and the
Yeah.
directness. And I'm like, oh yeah, I understand that. When I first moved out to California, I was kind of like, oh, this is great. People are so nice. And then after a while, I was like, people are just nice all the time. Like, how do you do that? But yeah, I'm pretty assimilated now to the West Coast. I've spent more time out here than I have on the East Coast by now. But that's
Yeah.
more a function of my age.
It's really interesting. I mean, your kind of the straightforward nature of communication nature on the East Coast, I would assume actually has a lot of benefits working in the Valley in these technology companies, especially with their focus on radical candor and executive communication. Have you kind of found that to be the case?
I think so. I think so. I've always been pretty open and direct, and was happy to find that that was actually a characteristic that people look for
Mhm.
in a potential leader. And so I never had a problem with that piece, and I've actually had to coach people on like, hey, you need to be more direct, and you need to just come out and say it sometimes.
Yeah, I want to get to your coaching experience and all the journey that you've had with that, which is super fascinating, by the way. So, but before we do that, I wanted to talk a little bit about your kind of your amazing career here. You started your career at Accenture, in San Francisco City, but just all around the peninsula and in Silicon Valley. And then you spent 4 years at HP and then 11 years at eBay. Could you walk us through a little bit of your beginnings here? You know,
Yeah, yeah. Well, what I would say is that I'm getting a little long in the tooth, and so I've been around the block maybe a couple times at this point, and so that means a pretty diverse set of experiences. I've been on more of the consulting and advisory side, which was my start at Accenture. Have gotten very deep into operational stuff, in my time at eBay and Lyft and some of the startups that I worked at. Then I've also gotten and started as individual contributor, have had jobs like that all the way to managing, I think, 600, 700
mm,
people. Have gone from, companies that are 10,000s of people down to, 10 and the variety that comes from there. And have just appreciated the different challenges that all of those present, right? It's very different advising and consulting versus operating a business. It's different, when you're just starting out in a 10-person startup to, having 10,000 people. The skills that you need to actually succeed are very different. It's been mostly tech, but even within tech, consumer or B2B or what have you. And then one of the more fascinating parts of the journey for me has been going from someone who didn't think I wanted to manage people because I had thought it was just administrative overhead and headaches, dealing with people, to I actually love, coaching and developing people and realizing that you can't get a lot done unless you have people. And so as I've, wanted to get more impact and I've wanted to do more bigger and greater things, like, hey, you have to work with and through people, and that's the thing that you have to do. But my attitudes have changed a lot through the journey. And I think that's been part of the rewarding part is just, seeing now where I've come from.
yeah, yeah. Actually, because I'm more familiar with, I always thought of Silicon Valley's tech revolution in two cycles. In recent time periods, there was the dot-com era, which you were fully a part of and helped build.
Yeah.
And then the second time was more what I have more experience with, which was the beginning of my career, in the early 2000s, sorry, in the 2011s, 2010s time when Airbnb and Uber and these players started
Yeah.
coming
Yeah.
out in the sharing economy. So I think you have a really unique perspective because you've been a operator and an executive in both of these two eras, right?
Yeah.
I guess my question is, do you agree that there's these two cycles, the 90s to the 2000s and then 2010s onward? And then do you see any kind of difference and similarities between these two cycles?
Yeah. Yes and no. I mean, I think there's an element of what goes around comes around, right? I was at Accenture when the dot-com boom happened
Hmm.
back in, what was that, late 1990s, 2000, around there. And everyone was jumping ship to go to whatever.com, like, doggy.com,
Yeah.
whatever you can put in front of .com, like that was the thing. There was just some super, not to use the cliche phrase, but irrational exuberance around it, and people
Mm.
just, wanting to get rich quick and going for it. And that's all fine. You see that happen over and over again. Right.
Yeah.
And so, like, I don't know how much, if the AI boom will result in some kind of bust as well. But you're starting to feel a little bit of that same thing come around again, where it's like, what is really going to come out of all this, and who are going to be the winners and who are going to be the losers? Because
Yeah.
not everyone's going to be a winner. Right. But I think that's kind of Silicon Valley. Like there's waves of technology that happen, and it's just going to be driven by a different trend or a different, new technology that's coming out.
Mhm.
And so I think that's part of it. And so the new things are exciting and they're always sexy and you always want to get involved with them. And they all present their new and interesting challenges. But the sort of cycle of boom and bust, I think, is definitely something that, you start to see the pattern after a while.
Yeah. If I had to rethink about it, I would say there's probably been three cycles. There's the dot-com era, then there was that whole sharing economy era,
Yeah.
and now we're past that and we're into this AI era, right?
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
pretty
I mean, you
fascinating.
can
Yeah.
throw in there some biotech stuff and you can throw
Sure.
in some other industries. But yeah, I think that's generally it. You kind of look at what the VCs are chasing after and you kind of know that that's the that's the thing, and it's either gonna boom or bust, or it's gonna do both over time.
Yeah. Earlier when we were talking, you said that development and coaching is the thing that energizes you most now
Yeah.
professionally. You mentioned that there's also a difference in the hired executives versus the founder mentality.
Right.
So I was wondering if we could dig a little deeper into that. What do you feel are the differences here in your experience? And
Yeah,
yeah,
right, right,
yeah,
right. Well, I'll take the founder hired executive piece first, and
yeah.
then maybe we can talk about the other one a little bit later on about developing and coaching people. But yeah, I became intrigued with working with founders in my time at Lyft. So
Yeah.
that was the first time I worked for a founder-led company. We had two founders, and so which is an interesting thing as well when you've got.
And can you remind the audience what you did at Lyft? Yeah.
Yeah. I was running the supply side, so the driver side of the business. So this was the period, in the lead up to the IPO. I think
Yeah.
when I joined the company, we were doing $500 million in revenue, and by the time I left, we were doing $2.5 billion in revenue, and I was like employee number, 600, and when I left, there was like 2,600 employees or something like that. But it was a crazy time and a really fun place to work in a new category. But first time I worked with a founder-led company, and this may be obvious to everyone, but I think it's worth saying. Founders just have a different attitude towards their business than hired executive. One, because it's their idea at the end of the day, it's their baby.
Yeah.
And if you take that parenting metaphor further, they're going to be super protective of that baby. They think that they are the only ones that know that baby as well as anyone can. And with that comes this sort of protective, maternalistic or paternalistic attitude towards it, like, don't touch my baby type of thing. Whereas the professional executive is sort of, they're brought in because they've seen this before, they've seen that business problem before, and it's a job for them, right? Let's face it, they didn't come up with the idea. It's not their baby. It's kind of like the difference between a nanny and a mother, right?
Right, right.
And so, and for all the good and bad reasons, right? And so a nanny might actually know how to take better care of the baby than the mother, because they've seen it before with several other babies. But it's, make no mistake, the mom or the dad is making the decisions because it's
Mm.
their kid, right? And so, but there's also just this like full on commitment from a founder, right? Because it's their baby and they're not going to let anything happen to that thing. And whereas a professional manager might be able to say, I'm shutting my laptop, I'm going to sleep. Parenting's a full-time job. It's 24/7. And, so it's just different from a founder's perspective. And then you get into the whole, look, does the founder really have what it takes to take it through all the stages of growth from 0 to 1 all the way through to I'm a public unicorn now,
Mm.
and all the different skills that comes with. And does the founder need to let go? I mean, there's lots of stories in Silicon Valley of the founders hanging on too long or not long enough, or coming back in the case of Steve Jobs, right? And so anyway, I just thought it was super fascinating to work in that environment. And then since then, I've been working with a lot of founders and kind of startups just because I just love the commitment, right? Like there's not, you can't just say, I'm going to quit tomorrow. You don't quit your baby.
Yeah.
Or if you are quitting your baby, that's a different decision than just going to HR and saying like, yeah, I'll take my package now.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. And um, actually, that kind of makes me, I might go off on a tangent here, but it does feel like the founder mentality in Silicon Valley, when you mention that it's full commitment, I totally agree with that sentiment. But how does that like differ from a small business owner? Imagine like
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
a small business owner in my
yeah,
father's generation, right?
yeah,
He bought and sold sunglasses and
yeah,
then created a retail store
yeah,
chain of
yeah,
sunglass stores,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Would you say that those founders are the same as these VC-backed Silicon Valley founders?
Yeah, I think there's definitely elements of this full commitment that are part and parcel of being a business owner, right?
Yeah.
Where it gets interesting is with the Silicon Valley model, you start to give away ownership for funding, right? And then you start to have to listen to people who are actually invested in you. And so, if you take the child rearing metaphor, right? Like, I don't think there is a metaphor for that. Like all of a sudden there's these other people who have an incentive and a right to tell you how to parent your child.
Yeah, it's different.
And if you think about it from a parenting standpoint, like that's kind of effed up.
Mm,
Why am I listening to you? Like I
sure.
need you because you're the only way that my kid's going to grow up to be what I want it to be. But now there's not two parents or one parent. There's a whole bunch of people who
Yeah.
get their say, and it's tough, right? And that's part of the challenge of being a founder in Silicon Valley is that you got to manage all your constituents. I'm not saying that running a small business that doesn't have, venture funding is easy by any means, but you certainly don't have that, board member from the VC who's like, when are you going to make me rich?
Hmm.
Can it be tomorrow instead of next week type of mentality? So yeah, I mean, and I think that's part of the real intrigue for me is you have to, as a founder in Silicon Valley today, the number of things that you have to navigate is just crazy. It's so complex, and how many people really have that ability to not only have the expertise to guide their company through strategic challenges, operational challenges, et cetera, but manage all these constituents who want to tell you what to do and think that they've got the right answer for you, as well as your employees, as well as your customers, et cetera, et cetera.
I mean, I was thinking earlier when you were talking, I was just thinking about, okay, how do you successfully coach and develop a founder?
Yeah.
And that question on surface is a simple question, but when you think deeper about it, it's an incredibly
Yeah.
challenging thing because by nature, they're an incredibly challenging path, right?
Yeah.
They have to have that resilience, that grit. And all of a sudden you're also saying, hey, you also have to be able to be a Zen Buddha master and take in opinions and feedback and calculate all that. So, and I know that you have personal experience in mentoring and coaching great
Yeah.
founders, but also hired executives and just people within the middle of their career journey, right?
Yeah.
Could you talk to me a little bit about kind of your journey coaching these three different sets of people?
Yeah, yeah. Well, sure. Yeah, yeah. The reason why I got into this whole thing is because of kind of how you're describing it. Like, wow, what a human experience. But stepping back for a second, you and I were having a conversation before we came on the recording here, and just talking about the things that really matter in life.
Yeah.
Right? And after working for a couple decades in Silicon Valley, I think what I learned was the thing that gave me the most energy and the thing that gave me the most satisfaction and gave me the most sense of achievement wasn't I hit this metric this month, this quarter, this year, whatever. Or it was good to get promotions and all of that stuff because it's a validation of hopefully some hard work and good work that you've done. But the most rewarding thing for me was when people would tell me I had a positive impact on them, right? And just knowing that you can help someone to succeed is a powerful thing. And in a corporate world, like you actually have the opportunity to do that quite a bit. And so I went from, I don't want to deal with HR issues and people to, this is an opportunity to actually help people to succeed. And listen, this isn't an altruistic thing and me saying like, all I want to do is help people. It's they're helping you as well. right? So it started as people that are working for me or with me. Together we can rise together. And if I can help you succeed, that's going to help me succeed as well, right? So there's definitely sort of a symbiotic relationship there. But I got to the point where I was like, well, you get to this point where you're like, I want to do more of the things I like to do and less of the things I don't like to do. And so
Mm,
one of the things that I like doing is helping people succeed. And so I thought, why don't I do that as kind of a part-time side gig for myself? And then, it's a good way to make a little bit of money and I can help people and get the rewards from that. And so I got a coaching certificate and I continue to coach, a handful of clients at a time. And it is really rewarding. I just enjoy helping people to try and be the best that they can be and to reach their version of success.
yeah,
And so I
absolutely.
guess I may have lost sight of the question here, but you're talking about working with different types of people.
Yeah, those,
Yeah, yeah,
the
yeah,
person in the
yeah,
middle of the career, the
yeah,
executive, the founders, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah. And so every stage has its different challenges. And the one thing I would say is that, coaching oftentimes veers into, and I don't mean this pejoratively, but like it does veer into a little bit of therapy
Uh,
because sometimes it's like people just need to talk things out, and I'm happy to provide that. But that being said, I think the reason why I believe that I can be helpful to people is not only that there's coaching methodologies and there's ways to help people that you can be trained for, but there's also the the fact that I've had some experience in what they're doing, right? Like
yeah,
I've gone through in some form or another something like they've been through. And I think that ends up being valuable, just hearing from someone else who's been through it or has a different perspective on it. And so that's what I'm sharing with a lot of my coaching clients is like, oh, I've seen something like this before.
of
I've
course.
seen
Yeah,
people try and attack it this way. I've seen people try and attack it that way. I myself have tried to do this in another way, and it gives them some comfort knowing like, oh, this isn't just me and I'm crazy, and that there's some options out there for me to solve my whatever challenge is going on. But yeah, I mean, the founder one is super interesting for all the things
mhm,
that you mentioned, right? They're dealing with so much at the end of the day. And most of the time, if you've got a founder who's bootstrapping their business, there's also this personal financial pressure going on of like, I'm not seeing a penny out of this thing until I can get to a certain point, right?
yeah,
And that's real. That's like,
yeah,
I'm not putting food on the table so long as I'm bootstrapping this thing, right?
yeah.
And so
They're
that
like,
that
this is
is
my mortgage we're talking about, right?
right, right,
I
right.
got to
And,
pay mortgage.
and just the level of urgency is that much higher than with the professional manager. And so if you look at it that way, it's kind of like, well, there's a highly leveraged situation where you can actually make a difference. And you're making a real difference because if you can help someone put food on the table, that's a little bit different than, oh, I made my next million.
Right. Hey,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So on that topic, how do you know when you are making a difference? Do you know it in the middle of the process or is it typically always retroactive? Like walk me through that
Yeah. Well, it's a joint thing, It's not me, standing on top of the mountain booming down wisdom.
yeah,
It's working together with the person and hopefully you have the right chemistry, helping them kind of work through their challenges. And so everyone's a little bit different and everyone's got slightly different variations of problems, right?
of course.
And so I think it's one of these things where it's an iterative process that you just work through with someone. And look, I ask for feedback all the time. You get trained as a coach to always make sure that you're adding value, right? And so you always check in, you always stop in the middle and say, is this useful? Are you finding this train of thought to be, helpful to you? Are we on the right track? Do you feel like this is going to be valuable to you going forward? And so you should be getting the feedback as you go along.
Yeah.
But, ultimately, this is one of the things I like about coaching as well, is that it's a highly leveraged conversation, right? And so I tell people when they ask me, why do you like doing this? And I usually respond with some version of this. I'm like, okay, how many meetings did you have today? Right. And they're usually like too many. I had like 10 meetings today. And I'm like, how many of those do you think were useful? Right.
Yeah.
And they'll usually say like, more than half of them were not that useful. And then I say, well, when you did have a productive meeting, what did that look like? And it's kind of like, I got something done. We got a decision or whatever. So the point being, like, a coaching conversation, if you get to the end of your hour or whatever you're set up for, and there's been no value delivered there, like, that was a waste. And this is a one-on-one conversation, and it's my job to be able to help that person within that session to get some value out of it. And I love that. It's kind of, for a coach, it's a stand and deliver time,
Yeah.
right?
Have you seen the TV show Billions with Axelrod, the hedge
No,
fund TV show?
no,
So it kind of reminds me, we were describing your coaching and development journey. It kind of reminds me of this TV show. It's called Billions. It's about this New York-based hedge fund guy who is like the cream of the crop, titan of industry
yeah,
in the hedge fund world. And in his company of traders and hedge fund traders, he actually employs a full-time therapist, like a trained psychologist.
yeah,
And
yeah,
this psychologist has weekly sessions with all of their traders, right?
yeah,
And it's so metrics driven that they were able to even track like their therapy sessions to how well they perform on their trades, right, over time.
mhm,
It's
mhm.
pretty fascinating. I think that the term human resources has basically been put into a corner of, all right, just go do the paperwork. But
Yeah,
it does feel like a lot of these corporations and these companies, both startups and non-startups alike, do need a element of kind of one-on-one and
yeah,
type of executive training
yeah,
or founder
yeah,
training and
yeah,
coaching
yeah.
and development,
Yeah. The one thing, you were talking a little bit about metrics and stuff
Yeah.
like that. And so one of the hard things to quantify, and you're asking, like, what does success look like in a coaching? I mean, sometimes there are hard metrics that you're looking for, like, hey, I need you to help me, achieve whatever. Or maybe it's a
Hmm.
promotion. Maybe it's insight into the business problem I'm facing, and I need to hit my goals and all that stuff. But I would say the overwhelming thing that I find myself solving for with coaching clients is clarity. And it's clarity of, like, what the hell am I doing? Where the hell am I going? Is it clear what I need to focus on? What are my priorities? What's most important to me? What's most important for in my position, et cetera, et cetera. It's just basically clarity. And I think a lot of times we get it's the fog of war, and we get lost in, what's the saying, the forest for the trees.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of helping people get back to, like, right, that was the thing I was actually trying to solve for.
Yeah.
That's the thing that's important to me. And that's super rewarding, because, there's not, you can see it in people's faces when they actually, I hate to use the word breakthrough, but they get to this point where it's all of a sudden clear to them. It's like, shit, yeah, that's
Yeah.
the thing I needed to do.
No, absolutely.
Sorry for cursing on your podcast.
No, of course. No, yeah. I mean, I get lost to the toilet sometimes because I have like 10 different tasks, you know what I mean? And
Yeah, yeah,
like, oh, I
yeah.
forgot. Yeah, one of them is to pee, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Sure.
I haven't dealt with that problem explicitly yet, but
Yeah.
I get what you're saying.
That's awesome. So, you know, okay, before we wrap up the coaching and the development piece, there's one last thing I wanted to talk about, which is, if you think about your experience coaching and developing, is there a moment, a tiny thing within your journey that you kind of go back to over and over again because it provides you this energy boost, right? It's like something, it could be an achievement. Most likely it is, but what is that thing, if anything?
Yeah. I can't say there was a lightning singular
Sure.
moment, but there have definitely been times when people have taken me aside to thank me for something that I did for them professionally and personally, professionally. It really struck me, like, this whole work thing it's a human endeavor.
Yeah.
And I think if you lose sight of, like, the human aspects of working with people and camaraderie and teamwork and helping others and that sort of thing, then I think you're unmoored from what's important, right? And so I can think of, a couple handful of instances where people went out of their way to thank me for something that I did for them that really just struck a chord for me. It made everything worth it.
Yeah. Yeah.
People have written me handwritten notes, and I've kept every single one of them. And I have them in this, drawer of
Oh man.
personal effects that I have.
Yeah.
And I don't go back and review them all the time, but every once in a while when I'm cleaning the house, I'll come across them and I'll be like, oh yeah, I kind of remember why, what's important. Yeah.
That's awesome. I mean, when I get a little bit of gratitude from the wife, I'm ecstatic. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
I can imagine.
Well, that's because it comes so rare for you.
Yeah, exactly. I think I need to
You mean
start
that
coaching
one
and developing
time?
her. Yeah, that one time.
That
I
was an
think
awesome moment for you, Rob.
it was. It was 2 years ago at the beginning. Was right after we got engaged. When she got the rock. Right.
She
Yeah.
said, thanks for the ring.
Yeah.
It's been all downhill from there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So I want to, it could be switching gears. It may not be actually, because when I think of this next topic, I do connect it a little bit to the meaning of work, but I do want to leave it a little more broad and open. So I want you to think of like two competing concepts of this bulldozing through life energy versus this fear of missing out energy, YOLO versus FOMO energy, right? So is there a memory or experience that you've personally initiated that you would consider YOLO or FOMO? And is there anything special about that time and place or memory and how it's kind of affected you?
I'm probably the last person that you want to ask this question to.
Okay.
So what I would say is that for most of my conscious adult life, I've really tried not to get bogged down by either YOLO or FOMO, right? Because I actually think that a lot of that stuff is driven externally rather than internally. Because, fear of missing out is completely in your control. You only live once is completely in your control. And I think we only have anxiousness around those when we start to compare ourselves with other people, which I think is like the evil curse of all evil curses. And, in a social media world, you're starting to see just how evil it is to just play this comparison game all day long. And so I think I've tried to rail against those kind of feelings whenever possible, because if I feel like I'm missing out on something, that's completely in my control. Like I can actually get in there and get involved. And, the YOLO thing of like, yeah, I get it. Yeah. I tell this story every once in a while, and I don't say it to too many people, but I guess I'm saying it to potentially a lot of people now. But like my mom's side has the men in the family tend to die young of like a massive heart attack. I think you and I may have talked about this.
Yeah, we did touch upon it.
They die of a massive heart attack in like their early 60s, right? And so it's always been in the back of my head. I'm like, well, I got those genes in me, and that could be me. And for a while, it freaked me out because I'm like, I'm gonna die young, like that's gonna suck. Everyone else is gonna be, you want to talk about fear of missing out. Like I'm gonna miss out on 30 plus years of life. But then I realized what a blessing it is to think that way, because it's kind of like, well, if I know I only have that amount of time, then I better make the most of it, right? And so live your life like it's precious all the time and that it's time's running out. You hear all these tragic stories about people who die prematurely, die suddenly, and oh, what a shame. I think it's all incumbent upon us to go to bed every night and say, like, have I lived my life the way I wanted to up into this point, right? Or not? Yeah. And if not, like, what are you going to do about it?
Yeah. Yeah. So it sounds like you definitely take life. You have a very strong sense of emotional control, and
I try.
Right.
I
You
try.
try.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it's all easy to say on a podcast, but when push comes to shove in your darker moments, yeah, of course you have fears and you have doubts and, you have uncertainty and the lack of clarity that I was talking about earlier.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I just really try to like live by that whole ethos of like life is precious, live life to the best of your abilities and to the fullest each and every day, and don't have any regrets. Is that
I've
is
been,
that YOLO? I don't know.
it could be. I mean, look, I think it's all about bringing self-awareness to yourself, right?
Yeah.
And you touched upon it a lot, I think just now, just, you know, if you have a high sense of self-awareness, maybe we can master this FOMO. But the first step is to actually acknowledge, as you mentioned, that I have this sense of fear of missing out, right?
Yeah.
And then the
Yeah.
second step is that, hey, it's actually not that big of a deal, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I would also
Yeah.
say, my observation is that, and that this has come through a lot of my coaching and just,
Mm-hmm.
observing people as I get older. But like, I think a lot of people wake up and realize that they're not living their own life. They've done things because someone else told them to do it, or they made turns along the way that they thought were small turns until they made another turn in that direction and another, and then they ended up so far off the path that they thought that they were on that they were like, what the hell happened?
Yeah.
And I think it's kind of what I was saying, like every day, every week, every month, you have to be able to say like, is it clear what I want to be doing? And am I doing that? It's okay if it's not, but like, are you doing the best that you can? And if you are bringing awareness around like, no, I think this one thing's off in my life. Are you doing something to bring it back to where you want it to be? Uh,
Yeah.
and so, we all have those moments where it's like, how the hell did I get here?
Yeah. No, I love the concept of reaching clarity. I mean, I've been reading this book on living an asymmetrical life, and it's like 4 steps. But the fourth step, really interesting, is this concept of writing your own story as opposed to recording your story, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah,
if I reflect, I mean, clarity comes and goes, right? It's
yeah,
kind of like it is so fleeting. It really
yeah,
is so fleeting, and
yeah.
I I'm trying to get into, I think we can all benefit. I'm trying to get into the habit of writing down the story that I want to tell for my life,
Mhm,
the
mhm.
story that I want to live. And for all I know, it could change next year,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
at
And I
least,
think it's super important to let that happen too.
Mm.
I'm not a big fan of like, when I meet people that are like, oh, in 2 years, I want to be here. In 5 years, I want to be there. In 10 years, I want to be there. And they say it so self-assuredly, I kind of cringe because I'm like,
Yeah.
you might want to be open to other possibilities. You might want to open yourself up to other things that come along, right?
But you were
Uh,
24 before too, at one point. At 24, you were
yeah,
saying the
yeah,
same
yeah,
things, right?
yeah, yeah. It's
Yeah.
easy. It's easy for me to say now, and I will make mistakes going forward, breaking those rules for
Yeah.
sure. I'm saying you need a plan, but you don't need a plan, right? And so, which is it? But
Yeah.
I do like, I like to think in terms of general direction, subject to change,
Sure.
right?
Sure.
Not
Sure.
like specific. I need to do
Yeah.
X.
What you just said totally reminds me of something, a concept. Imagine any sport, okay? It could be drive a race car, manual race car. It could be racing bikes, or it could be lacrosse, whatever. You remember in those sports, there's always a standard way of doing things. And then when you ask the master, his advice is always like, oh, don't worry about that part,
Yeah,
right? Or like in driving a manual car, for example, it says, oh yeah, you don't always have to rev shift, rev match downshift, for
yeah,
example, right?
yeah.
These kind of things. But it's really intriguing because I remember growing up, my father would always give me these sage life advices, right? He would
Mm,
say something like, hey, Robert, you know, you don't have to, you just got to work hard and then let the chips fall where they may,
yeah,
right? And don't take control of things. But then when you're in school, you're taught like, hey, you got to write a plan, right?
yeah.
You got to
Yep,
figure out what your
yep,
thesis is, and then
yep,
what
yep,
is your 5-year career goal, right?
yep,
And then somebody who's super accomplished comes to you and says, hey, that doesn't make sense. Let's rip it all up
yeah,
and let's start again, right?
yeah, yeah,
And I think this balancing act between these two energies is so fascinating.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean it's a journey, right? And it's so cliche, but it is and it will be a journey and you don't know where it's all gonna lead to because you don't know what you're gonna get exposed to, who you're gonna meet, all that kind of stuff. But I think you do need some general sort of like, hey, I'm heading east-ish, not
Uh-huh.
west-ish type of thing. I mean, yeah, but I think our society creates this like it overvalues this whole planning aspect, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, if you plan it, you can manifest and it'll happen. And so like, the one I always use is Tiger Woods wrote on his wall or whatever, I'm gonna win this by this age, that by this, I'm gonna win my first
Yeah.
major by this, I'm gonna beat Jack Nicklaus's record by this age. And he did all except the last one, right?
Wow.
And it's like,
Mm.
okay. So how many people for whom that's their experience, right? Like,
Right. Right. Yeah.
yeah, don't glorify that example in society, right? Because first of all, we didn't talk at all about what does it take to actually go and hit those milestones, right?
Mm.
The fact that like he had parents that were willing to help him do that, the fact that, he had this God-given talent that no one else has, like, all that kind of stuff. And it's like, that's just not the way life works, right? But
Totally.
I think if you point yourself in a general direction and you work hard and you control the things that you can control and you don't treat people shitty and like get things and you open yourself up to the possibility that, whatever direction you're heading in, it may not be what you want to do tomorrow or the next week, you'll be fine.
Nice. Yeah. That's a good point. So I was hoping we can talk a little bit about America. I think this is a topic that's been on my mind a lot over the last few years, ever since I moved back from
Yeah.
Shanghai. So every so often I update this chart I have. It compares super simple chart. It just compares household income to household debt to inflation, to home prices, poor thing. And as you can imagine, not surprisingly, but household income, when compared to these other line items, almost looks stagnant
Yeah. Yeah.
over the last 2 decades, right? Ultimately, cost of living has far outpaced
Yeah.
income growth here.
Yeah.
So I guess in your experience being an advisor to a lot of these startup companies in America, especially in the technology scene, but also being a coach for employees and corporate people who want to climb the corporate game, how do you think this is kind of reshaping the financial decisions of younger generations? Are we kind of witnessing the death of the traditional middle class aspirations, right? Something to think about.
That's a big topic there.
Yeah.
Well, the first thing I would say is that, I think in this country, we do our kids a huge disservice by not teaching financial literacy
Mm.
in the schools, right?
Yeah.
Just the basics about, how you should think about a household budget, how you should think about your income versus other expense line items that you're going to face in your life, a little bit about how, investments work,
Yeah.
all that
Personal
kind of stuff.
finance,
Yep, yep. And so
taxes. We don't teach taxes.
taxes, right. And so no surprise, right? Like we're a nation laden in debt and you've got financial services companies that are preying on people. Either, we had the subprime mortgage thing that was going on and you've got consumer credit that's kind of a exploding problem now. And so it's too easy for people to spend and it's too hard for people to save and budget, right? And we've made it that way. Like the consumer forces have made it that way. Like retail financial services is a freaking disaster, man. Like how many credit card offers did you get this week?
But you're saying you think that's a function of the consumers and not so much of the companies and capitalism in general?
Oh, I think it's all part of the same problem, right? Like because people aren't literate in sort of personal finance, they are preyed upon by, lending companies and financial services companies. And it's just this vicious cycle. But yeah, I mean, it's pretty tough. And so that's sort of like you and me and the consumers and whatever. And then you've got the government who kind of does the same thing, right? Like
Yeah.
overspends their means, just need money. We'll print some more,
Yeah. Yeah. yeah, we don't have a good role model, you know.
Exactly,
Certainly not.
exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
So no surprise, right? And then you've got sort of these. I'm always shocked by two things, like, and it's part of the same. It's part of the same two sides of the same coin. You know, we're talking about Silicon Valley. Like you always see on LinkedIn these people who publish stats of the number of companies that were formed last year, the number of companies that got a seed round, then an A round, then a B round, then a C round. Right? And I think the one that I was just looking at, like, it's 0 point whatever percent of companies actually get to some kind of liquidity event.
Good. Wow.
And so
Yeah.
that's, crazy, crazy odds. It kind of begs the question, like, why would a founder ever start a company? Like you actually have to be a little bit crazy to do that. Um, but I would match that up with every day on the 101, I drive by one of those big billboards that says what the Powerball lottery is at right now. I
Mm,
drove past it today. It was at $280 million. And that's probably the lowest number I've seen in like the last several months. But people still buy those things, right? Like to the tune of they raised $280 million. And it's actually times two because they only pay out half of it, right?
yeah.
So like $280 million, let's just say people put $560 million into Powerball since the last time someone won, which is only a couple months ago. Like that's what we're doing with our money,
Yeah.
right? Like good luck. And so it's kind of like the American dream is turned into like literally a lottery ticket.
Yeah. Well, so my father moved to America in the late 50s, something like early 60s. And his first job was a New York City cab driver in Flushing. And he was telling me that in those days, he could work a year. Or no, he could work 9 months and then save enough money to go travel for 3 months out of a year.
Yeah,
Literally,
yeah,
right? So
yeah,
this is
yeah,
on
yeah,
top of his rent and everything, right?
yeah,
And I'm just thinking like, that's nowhere near possible today, right?
yeah,
Yeah, an Uber driver is not going to be pulling in those numbers.
right.
And it just feels very iffy about the
Yeah,
future of the middle class in America. I'm
yeah,
personally quite concerned about it. It's something I think a lot about. And I don't actually think there is a a really clear solution. Like one thing that keeps coming to my mind is, I mean, you know, education around spending, consumerism, and debt is one thing, and that's something we should definitely try our best to fix. But I'm more concerned about the income side
yeah,
and the production side.
yeah,
And then when I think about the income side for the average household, it really begs the question, which is, it sounds like a silly question, but what does America produce? We don't actually, it doesn't seem like we produce
yeah,
much anymore.
yeah,
I'm not trying to go sing the Trump rhetoric like, we're not producing coal, we're not
yeah, yeah,
manufacturing steel. I mean, more in a broader sense,
yeah,
like,
yeah,
what do Americans actually make?
yeah,
It seems like we have, if you look at it from just an kind of capital intensive or capital perspective, then you have the technology companies, you have Hollywood, you have pharmaceuticals and stuff like that. But what about the industries that's going to employ the next 250,000 people,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
It doesn't seem like, I can't think of one, honestly.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's troubling.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think there's a lot of things wrapped up in there.
Yeah.
The immediate thing that comes to my thought is maybe there's a couple things, and I was just talking about this with a couple people at lunch. Yeah, I mean, a large segment of our economy is financial services,
Mm,
which is literally, cycling money and taking fees from cycling money,
gross.
or yeah, making money off of investments, or
And this is
gaming the
helping
financial
people
system.
with money.
Right, 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 right. Yeah. And so that's kind of an interesting thing, as we've outsourced manufacturing and all of that stuff, we've become much more reliant on those types of jobs, which is, I don't know what to make of that, because it's like, I get what you're saying. Shouldn't we be producing stuff, right? Instead of just like moving money from one pile to another and
Yeah.
making it. all of it, right? And doing that a billion times a day. Yeah. And then, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think the United States is the ruling class in the United States is the people in power are seem to be solving more for kind of
Yeah.
the top earners in the country. And, we're supposed to be a welfare state that's supposed to redistribute wealth to kind of help out people at the bottom of that pyramid, right? And it doesn't seem to be working. It's certainly not working better. It's probably working worse than before. But yeah, I think the conversation I was having with someone the other day is like, it doesn't seem like it's fair that there's a fair level playing field for everyone anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is kind of
Yeah, certainly
depressing.
not. Yeah.
I mean, listen, we're sitting here and we're in the probably the more privileged
Mm.
part of that pyramid, right? And so it's easy for us to sit here and say that, but like there's a lot of people who are just struggling, and what is the path to other than playing the Powerball
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
or thinking that you're going to strike it rich in some, parlor game. Yeah.
Well, we didn't really get too much into the opportunity to be a parent to three kids. I think
Yeah.
that's a huge thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah. One thing I would say about that is, having kids just gives you a different perspective on things. And there was a professor, I guess it was in my graduate studies. I think it was a business ethics class I was taking. And I think the way he described it is, like when you're wondering whether you should do something or not, just imagine your kid is sitting on your shoulders when you do it, and
Mm.
you'll come up with the right answer. It's such a simple thing that he's kind of said, and I didn't think anything of it at the time. And I probably thought about it a few times before I had kids. But once I had kids, I sort of got it. But I think I find that a lot of people could do well to think about things that way.
Yeah.
Would you do the same thing that you just did if your kid were sitting on your shoulder watching you? Now, listen, there's of course things that kids shouldn't be involved in, period. But
Yeah, 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 yeah.
but that's besides the main point here.
Yeah.
And so, I think I've been watching that show Severance on Apple,
Oh,
where
yeah, I just started it.
you
Yeah, it's
separate your
awesome.
work life
Yeah.
and your personal life. And there's definitely some benefits to that. And sometimes I think, yeah, that would have been super helpful. By the way, do you watch the show?
Yeah, I just started it. Yeah.
You know the building that they go into, Lumen?
Yeah.
My dad worked in that building.
What?
That is the old Bell Labs in Holmdel, New Jersey. And my dad
Oh,
worked there for, I don't know, 35 years, and, went into Lumen every day. And I have
crazy.
been in that building many, many times. Like I used to go in for lunch and hang out because it was literally like 3 miles from our place. We should have started the podcast with this when you were
Yeah.
talking about me growing up in New Jersey. But anyway, like, yeah, that's great. You're separating your home and professional life, but I think that's one area where you can integrate and like think about things in that way. Like, hey, would a child approve of what you're doing here? Because one of the things that I have noticed in my travels around Silicon Valley is that there's a lot of shitty behavior that goes on.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Like the whole, we've gotten into this whole tech bro mentality, and, sexual harassment and issues at work and
And
stuff
fraud.
like that. Fraud.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, what was the blood company? There's
Yeah.
Sam
Theranos. Yeah.
Freed, right? Like all these guys, it's sort of like, they could have just stick to that rule. If your kid were sitting on your shoulders, would you have done all that stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what comes first, if it's money or integrity. And it seems like a lot of the times integrity is compromised when there's a lot of money on the table.
Yeah. I mean, listen, I'm all for pushing the needle and testing the boundaries and all of that stuff, but you got to know where the line is.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Brian. I think that we'll wrap that up today. Wrap this podcast up like here.
Cool,
And
man.
thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me. That was a great conversation.